The motel room door closed behind me, and I knew my life was over. Not because of the affair. I'd been sleeping with my gardener for 3 months by then. Not because of the lies I'd told my husband, my children, everyone who trusted me. The room went dark because of what Daniel just said. $5,000 by Friday, or your husband gets every detail. I'd been used, manipulated, played from the very first compliment in my garden. The man I'd risked everything for, the man I thought saw me, really saw me, was nothing but a con artist who targeted my loneliness like a predator. I just handed him the power to destroy what was left of my life, and he was going to use it. The Georgia heat pressed down on Sandy Springs like a heavy blanket that June afternoon. Margaret Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, watching the man trim the azaleas along her property line. Sweat darkened the back of his gray work shirt as he moved with practiced efficiency through her meticulously planned garden. She'd lived in this house for 18 years, raised 2 children here, hosted countless neighborhood gatherings. Everything looked perfect from the outside. The manicured lawn, the colonial-style home with its white columns, the luxury SUV in the circular driveway. But perfection, she'd learned, was just another word for emptiness. "Margaret, I'm heading to the office." Her husband Richard's voice came from behind her, flat and businesslike. She didn't turn around. She knew what she'd see, the same expensive suit, the same distracted expression, the same man who'd stopped seeing her years ago. "On Saturday?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Henderson merger won't close itself." His footsteps moved toward the garage door. No kiss, goodbye, no touch, no acknowledgement that they were anything more than roommates who happened to share a last name and a mortgage. The door clicked shut. Margaret was 53 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time her husband had really looked at her. Not the quick glance across the dinner table, or the absent-minded nod when she spoke. Really looked. The way he used to when they were young, when her laugh could make him smile, when they'd talk for hours about nothing and everything. Now they existed in parallel lines that never touched. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and stepped out onto the back patio. The humidity hit her immediately, that thick Georgia moisture that made everything feel slower, heavier. Cicadas buzzed in the oak trees. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower rumbled to life. Mrs. Whitmore. The gardener straightened up from the flower bed, pulling off his work gloves. "I wanted to ask about the hydrangeas by the back fence. They're not getting enough water." His name was Daniel Reyes. He'd been maintaining her property for about 6 months, recommended by her neighbor Sheila Patterson. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. He spoke with a slight accent, Colombian, she'd learned, and had an easy, genuine smile that seemed rare these days. "What do you suggest?" Margaret asked, moving closer to inspect the drooping blue blooms. "I can adjust the sprinkler system," Daniel said, kneeling down to show her the dry soil. "See here? The water's not reaching this corner. I can run a new line, maybe add a drip system. These hydrangeas, they're thirsty plants. They need attention." Something in the way he said it, "they need attention," struck her. She found herself nodding. "Yes, please do that. You have a beautiful garden, Mrs. Whitmore." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. Someone who cares this much about their plants, they usually have a good soul. It was such a simple compliment, probably something he said to all his clients. But when was the last time Richard had noticed anything about her, let alone complimented her soul? "Thank you," she said quietly. That's kind of you to say." Their eyes met for just a moment. His were dark brown, warm, with crow's feet at the corners that suggested he smiled often. Then he looked away, picking up his tools. "I'll be back Monday to fix the watering system," he said. "Unless you need anything else today." "No, that's fine. Monday is perfect." She watched him load his equipment into his truck, an older Ford with D. Reyes landscaping painted on the side. He waved as he pulled away, and she found herself waving back, standing alone in her beautiful, empty backyard. That evening, Margaret sat at the dinner table with Richard and their daughter, Emily, who was home from college for the summer. Their son, Andrew, had his own apartment in Midtown Atlanta now, rarely visiting. The roast chicken she'd prepared sat between them, untouched ritual. "How was your day?" Margaret asked Richard, knowing it was pointless but unable to stop herself from trying. "Busy," he said, cutting his food with mechanical precision. "Henderson's team is being difficult about the IP clauses." "What about your day, Mom?" Emily asked, scrolling through her phone, despite Margaret's repeated requests that they keep devices off the table. "I worked in the garden. The hydrangeas need attention." Emily didn't look up. "The gardener said I have a good soul," Margaret added, immediately regretting it. How pathetic that she was fishing for connection by repeating a stranger's casual comment. Richard didn't react at all. Emily glanced up briefly. "That's nice," she said with polite disinterest, then returned to her screen. Margaret set down her fork. She wasn't hungry. She never was anymore. Later, lying in bed while Richard snored softly beside her, she stared at the ceiling and wondered when exactly everything had died. There'd been no big fight, no dramatic moment, just a slow fade, like flowers wilting in dry soil, starved of water and light and care. She thought about Daniel Reyes saying she had a good soul, about the way he'd looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, present, attentive. It meant nothing, she told herself. He was the gardener. It was his job to be pleasant. But as she drifted towards sleep, she realized she was already looking forward to Monday. Monday arrived with the heavy promise of afternoon thunderstorms. By 10 a.m., the temperature had already climbed to 90 degrees, and the sky hung low and gray over Sandy Springs. Margaret had changed outfits 3 times that morning, finally settling on jeans and a light blue blouse, casual but put together. Not that it mattered. She was just talking to the gardener about irrigation. Daniel's truck pulled into her driveway at 11. She watched from the kitchen window as he unloaded his equipment, then forced herself to wait a full 5 minutes before going outside. She didn't want to seem eager. Eager for what? She pushed the thought away. "Mrs. Whitmore," Daniel greeted her with that warm smile. "Good timing. I was just about to start." "Please call me Margaret," she heard herself say. "Mrs. Whitmore makes me feel ancient." He laughed. "You're not ancient." "But okay, Margaret. I'm Daniel." They walked together to the back corner of the yard. He explained the irrigation system in detail. Valve placement, water pressure, timer settings. Margaret found herself actually listening, not because she cared about sprinkler mechanics, but because he spoke to her like her opinion mattered. He asked questions. He waited for answers. "How long have you been doing landscaping, Aniane?" she asked as he worked. 15 years, Daniel said, digging a narrow trench for the new water line. "Started with my uncle's crew in Marietta when I first came from Colombia. Saved enough to start my own business 5 years ago." "That's impressive." He shrugged, but she could see pride in his expression. "It's honest work. I like making things grow, making them beautiful. There's something satisfying about taking something neglected and bringing it back to life." Was he still talking about gardens? Margaret felt her pulse quicken slightly. "Do you have family here?" she asked, then immediately worried the question was too personal. "My mother lives in Smyrna. I see her every Sunday. No wife, no kids." He said it matter-of-factly, without sadness or defensiveness. "I was engaged once, back in Colombia. But she didn't want to leave her family. I came anyway. Thought she'd change her mind, but..." He trailed off with a small smile. "Some things aren't meant to be. I'm sorry. Don't be. I have a good life. Freedom to build my business. Take care of my mother. Not everyone needs the same path, you know." Margaret thought about her own path, the one that had seemed so clear 25 years ago. College, marriage, Career as a paralegal until Emily was born. Perfect suburban life. When had it become a trap? What about you? Daniel asked, looking up at her. You have a beautiful home, beautiful garden. You must be happy. The question caught her off guard. The polite answer formed automatically. Yes, of course. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the heat or the intimacy of the moment, or the simple fact that this man seemed genuinely interested in her answer. I have everything I'm supposed to want, she said instead. But I can't remember the last time I felt seen. Like I matter beyond what I do for everyone else. Daniel stopped working. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, and looked at her with such genuine understanding that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I see you, he said quietly, for what it's worth. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The first fat raindrops began to fall. I should let you work, Margaret said, suddenly panicked by the vulnerability she'd just exposed. Margaret! The way he said her name stopped her. Being seen is a basic human need. There's no shame in wanting it. The rain came harder. They both laughed, running for the covered patio. By the time they reached shelter, they were both soaked. Margaret's blouse clung to her, and she wrapped her arms self-consciously across her chest. Daniel grabbed a towel from his truck and handed it to her. Thank you, she said, drying her face and hair. This humidity is insane. Welcome to Georgia summer, he said, his own shirt dripping. I should probably come back tomorrow when it's dry. Or you could come inside, have some iced tea, wait out the storm. The words came out before she could stop them. Innocent, neighborly, completely appropriate. So why did her heart hammer as she said them? Daniel hesitated. Professional boundaries flickered across his face. Then he smiled. Iced tea sounds perfect. They sat at her kitchen table, the rain drumming against the windows. Margaret poured sweet tea into tall glasses filled with ice. They talked, really talked. About his childhood in Medellin, about her early years in Athens where she'd gone to UGA, about music and books and the strange isolation of modern life. He asked about her children, and she found herself describing Andrew and Emily as real people rather than accomplishments to list. He asked about Richard, and she said, We've grown apart. It wasn't a lie, but it was a door opening. That's hard, Daniel said, being alone while you're with someone. Yes. She met his eyes. Exactly that. The rain stopped after an hour. Daniel should have left. Margaret should have walked him to the door. Instead, they kept talking. He showed her photos on his phone, his mother's birthday party, a garden he'd designed in Roswell, the mountains back home in Colombia. She showed him pictures, too. Emily's graduation, Andrew's wedding last year in Savannah, a family photo from 5 years ago where everyone smiled but nobody's eyes showed happiness. You deserve more than this, Daniel said, looking at that picture. I'm 53, Margaret said. I have what I have. That's the trap, he said gently, thinking it's too late to bloom again. When he finally left, 2 hours after he'd arrived, Margaret stood in her doorway watching his truck disappear down the tree-lined street. Something had shifted, something dangerous and electric and terrifying. She told herself it was nothing, just a nice conversation, harmless. But as she cleaned up the tea glasses, she realized she was smiling for the first time in months. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel found reasons to return. A broken sprinkler head, concerns about Japanese beetles on the roses, recommendations for fall planting. Each visit stretched longer than the last. Each conversation went deeper than the previous one. Margaret began timing her days around his visits. She'd check her appearance in the mirror before going outside. She'd prepare fresh squeezed lemonade. She'd wear her better clothes, the ones that still fit well despite the 20 pounds she'd gained over the years. Richard never noticed. He'd glance up from his laptop sometimes when Daniel's truck was in the driveway, but that was it. Gardener here again? He'd ask, and Margaret would nod, and that was the extent of it. Emily was more observant. "Mom, why is the landscaper here so much?" she asked one evening. "The garden needs a lot of work," Margaret answered too quickly. Her daughter gave her a long look. "Uh-huh." The moment of real danger came on a Thursday afternoon. The thunderstorm rolled in fast, so fast that Daniel barely made it to the patio before the deluge hit. Margaret brought out towels, but this time, when their hands touched passing the fabric, neither pulled away immediately. "Margaret," Daniel said, his voice different, urgent. "I need to be honest with you." Her breath caught. "Okay. I think about you, more than I should, more than is professional." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "I'm not trying to complicate your life, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this." "Feel what?" she whispered, though she knew. "Like I want to know everything about you. Like I want to make you laugh every day. Like I can't stop wondering what it would be like to—" He stopped himself. "I should go. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything." "Don't go," Margaret said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Please don't go." They stood there on the covered patio, soaking wet, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Margaret felt herself moving forward, or was he moving toward her? Later she wouldn't remember who closed the distance first. His lips were soft, gentle. His hand cupped her face like she was something precious. Margaret kissed him back, and all the loneliness and hunger and desperate need for connection poured into that moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, reality crashed back. "Oh, God," Margaret said. "Oh, God, what did I just do?" "Margaret!" "You should leave," she said, panic rising. "You should leave right now." Daniel grabbed his things and left without another word. Margaret stood on the patio, shaking, her lips still tingling, her mind screaming at her stupidity. She'd just kissed the gardener. She'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. But as the rain poured down and the thunder rolled across Georgia, drowning out the sound of her ragged breathing, Margaret realized the most terrifying thing of all. She wanted more. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay rigid in bed beside Richard, replaying the kiss over and over, each time feeling equal parts guilt and longing. What had she done? She was a 53-year-old married woman with grown children, a reputation in the community, membership at the Sandy Springs Country Club. People like her didn't do things like this, but she had. And worse, she wanted to do it again. Friday morning, Richard left early for a business trip to Charlotte. "Back Sunday night," he said, barely glancing at her. Margaret nodded, throat tight with things she couldn't say. After he left, she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, hands trembling. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. But she knew. "I can't stop thinking about yesterday. I'm sorry if I overstepped. But I'm not sorry I finally told you the truth." Daniel Margaret stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding. The smart thing would be to delete it, block the number, find a new landscaping service, end this before it destroyed everything. Instead, she typed, "I can't stop thinking about it either." The response came immediately. "Can I see you?" This was the moment, the fork in the road. Margaret could see both paths clearly, the safe one where she stayed in her loveless marriage and died slowly inside, and the dangerous one where she reached for something that made her feel alive but would ruin her life. She chose destruction. "Richard's out of town. Come over tonight." That evening, Margaret changed clothes 4 times, settling on a simple summer dress. She opened a bottle of wine to calm her nerves but barely touched it. When Daniel's truck pulled into her driveway at 8 p.m., after the neighbors had mostly gone inside, her heart was racing so hard she thought she might pass out. "Hi," he said when she opened the door. He'd cleaned up, wore actual jeans instead of work pants, a button-down shirt instead of his usual t-shirt. He held a bouquet of gardenias from somewhere, not her own garden. "Hi," she managed. They sat on her couch, the wine between them, and talked in circles around what they both knew was going to happen. Margaret learned more about him. His father had died when Daniel was 12. His younger sister still lived in Medellin with her family. He loved American jazz and Colombian coffee and old movies. He asked about her dreams, the ones she'd had before marriage and children, the ones she'd buried. "I wanted to be a lawyer," Margaret admitted. "Not a paralegal, a real lawyer. I was accepted to law school at Emory. What happened? I got pregnant with Andrew. Richard was already working at his firm. It made more sense for me to step back, to support his career. One child became 2. The years passed." She shook her head. "I don't regret my children, but sometimes I wonder who I would have been." "It's not too late," Daniel said. "You could still—" "I'm 53. So, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in her 40s when she became a law professor. You think age matters more than passion? No one had talked to her like this in years. No one had suggested she could be more than what she already was. When Daniel kissed her this time, it wasn't gentle. It was hungry, urgent, months of loneliness and need finally breaking through. Margaret kissed him back with equal desperation, and when he pulled her close, she let herself sink into it, into him, into the moment, into the terrible, beautiful mistake. They made love on her couch, then later in her guest room. Daniel was attentive, generous, present in ways Richard hadn't been in over a decade. For those hours, Margaret felt desired, wanted, seen. For those hours, she forgot about consequences. But morning always comes. Daniel left before sunrise, and Margaret sat alone in the wreckage of what she'd done. She stripped the guest bed, erasing evidence. She showered until her skin was raw. She told herself it was a one-time thing, a moment of weakness, something she'd never repeat. By Monday, he was back in her bed. By Tuesday, they'd started texting constantly, careful, coded messages that gave nothing away but meant everything. By Wednesday, she was lying to everyone. The affair became its own ecosystem. Margaret would meet Daniel at cheap motels off Highway 85 during the afternoons, when Richard thought she was running errands. She'd tell Emily she had book club or volunteer work at the church. She'd clear her texts immediately, hide receipts, maintain elaborate schedules in her head to avoid getting caught. The guilt ate at her, but not enough to stop. Because when she was with Daniel, she felt alive. He wanted to know her thoughts, her feelings, her fears. He made her laugh. He held her afterward and talked about real things. He saw her. "Leave him," Daniel urged one afternoon in a run-down motel room in Forest Park. "You're miserable with Richard. I see it in your eyes every time you come back from home." "I can't just leave," Margaret said, pulling on her clothes. "There's Emily to think about, and Andrew, and the—" "Excuses," Daniel said, but not unkindly. "Your children are grown. Emily's 20, Andrew's 23, and married. They'll understand." "Will they?" Margaret's voice went sharp. "Will they understand their mother throwing away 25 years of marriage for the gardener? Will the women at the club understand when I show up with you? Will—" She stopped, hearing her own words. The gardener. The unspoken class distinction she'd just revealed. Daniel heard it too. His expression hardened. "Is that what I am to you? The help you're slumming with? No, God, no, that's not—" But it was too late. The words were out, exposing the ugly truth beneath the romance. She was a wealthy white woman from Buckhead, having an affair with her Latino landscaper. The cliché was so obvious it made her sick. "I should go," Daniel said coldly. "Please, I didn't mean—" But he was already gone. Margaret drove home, crying so hard she had to pull over twice. What was she doing? She was destroying her marriage, her reputation, her sense of self. And for what? For a man she barely knew? For a fantasy that could never survive in the real world. But Daniel texted that night. "I'm sorry. I overreacted. Can we talk tomorrow?" And Margaret, unable to stop herself, unable to break the pattern, replied, "Yes." The next 2 months passed in a blur of lies and stolen moments. Margaret became an expert. She maintained
deception.
her perfect facade at home, while her real life happened in cheap hotel rooms and his apartment in Decatur, and once, recklessly, in her own bedroom when Richard was in Birmingham for 3 days. She thought she was being careful. She thought she was managing the risk. She didn't notice Emily watching her more closely, asking pointed questions about her whereabouts. She didn't see Sheila Patterson, her neighbor, frown when Daniel's truck stayed parked in her driveway for hours. She didn't realize her credit card statements showed purchases at motels and restaurants Richard would never recognize. She didn't see the trap closing around her until it was too late. The first crack came when Emily confronted her. "Mom, where were you Tuesday afternoon? I called the church. They said you haven't volunteered in weeks." I was at the store," Margaret stammered. "For 3 hours. Emily, I don't appreciate being interrogated. Are you having an affair?" Her daughter's voice was flat, clinical. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Margaret's face must have confirmed everything because Emily's expression crumbled. "Oh my God, you are. You're actually having an affair. Emily, please, it's complicated. With who? Someone from the club?" Then Emily's eyes widened. "Oh my God, it's the gardener, isn't it? I saw how you look at him. I thought I was imagining it, but—" "Stop." Margaret's voice broke. "Please stop. Does Dad know?" "No. And you can't tell him. Please, Emily, I'll end it. I promise I'll end it. Just don't—" "I'm not lying for you," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not covering for you. You need to tell him or I will." She left Margaret standing in the kitchen, the world spinning around her. Margaret grabbed her phone with shaking hands and texted Daniel, "We need to stop. It's over. Please don't contact me again." His response came an hour later. "Just like that? After everything? I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. We need to talk in person. Please." Against every instinct screaming at her to cut contact completely, Margaret agreed to meet him one final time at their usual motel. She told herself she owed him a real goodbye. She told herself she needed closure. The truth was simpler. She wasn't ready to let go. The motel parking lot was nearly empty on that Wednesday afternoon. Margaret's hands shook as she parked her SUV behind the building, her usual spot where passing drivers couldn't see her vehicle from the road. September had arrived with slightly cooler temperatures, but inside her car, she felt suffocated by heat and dread. She should have ended it over text. She should have blocked his number. She should never have started this at all. Daniel was already waiting in room 118, their room. He opened the door before she could knock, and the look on his face made her stomach clench. This wasn't the warm, attentive man she'd fallen for. His eyes were hard, calculating. "We need to talk," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Margaret entered the familiar space. Cheap floral bedspread, generic landscape prints, the smell of industrial cleaning products barely masking years of other people's secrets. This room had been their sanctuary. Now it felt like a crime scene. "Daniel, I meant what I texted. We have to stop this. Because your daughter found out." He moved to the window, peering through the curtain at the parking lot. "You knew this would happen eventually." "I know, and you were right. I can't keep living this lie." "So you're choosing him, Richard, the man who ignores you, who hasn't seen you in years." "I'm not choosing him," Margaret said, her voice rising. "I'm choosing to not destroy my family, my reputation, everything I've built." "Everything you've built?" Daniel spun around, and she saw real anger there. "You mean the perfect house and the country club membership and the neighbors who smile while they judge you? That's what matters to you? That's not fair. What's not fair is you using me." His voice went cold. "You were bored, lonely, needed attention. I was convenient. The gardener, someone you could slum with and then discard when it got complicated." "That's not true. I care about you, but not enough to actually be with me. Not enough to leave your comfortable life." Margaret felt tears building. "It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. Daniel moved closer, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his expression. Calculation, manipulation. You made me believe we had something real, made me think you were different, but you're just another bored housewife who wanted an adventure. Stop it. Do you know what I gave up for you? He continued. I turned away other clients so I'd have time for you. I told my mother I'd met someone special. I let myself believe you'd actually choose me. Daniel, please. I need money. The words dropped into the room like stones. Margaret stared at him. What? I need money, he repeated, calmer now. My truck needs major repairs. I'm behind on rent. I took on debt thinking we had a future, thinking you'd help me build my business like you kept promising. Remember? You said you believed in me. Margaret's blood ran cold. I never promised you money. No? All those conversations about how you wanted to help me expand, get better equipment, hire employees, that was just pillow talk. Those were just ideas, conversations. I never committed to $5,000, Daniel said flatly. That's what I need, for the truck repairs and to catch up on bills. You're blackmailing me. I'm asking the woman who claimed to care about me to help me the way I helped her. His voice hardened. Or I can help Richard understand where his wife has been spending her afternoons. The room tilted. Margaret grabbed the cheap dresser to steady herself. You wouldn't. Try me. This wasn't the man she'd kissed in her garden. This wasn't the gentle soul who'd listened to her dreams. This was a stranger wearing Daniel's face. And Margaret realized with sick clarity how completely she'd been played. You planned this, she whispered. From the beginning. The compliments, the attention, making me feel special. Don't flatter yourself, Daniel said with a cruel smile. You weren't the first lonely housewife I've worked for. Just the easiest. You were so desperate for attention, so hungry to feel wanted. It was almost too simple. The words hit like physical blows. Margaret thought of every intimate moment, every confession, every time she'd believed he saw her, really saw her. It had all been a performance. A con. 5,000, Daniel repeated. Cash. By Friday. Or Richard gets a very detailed email about his wife's activities, complete with timestamps and motel receipts I've been keeping. You bastard, Way. That's the spirit. He moved toward the door. I'll text you where to leave the money. And Margaret, don't try anything stupid. I have backups of everything. He left her standing in that dingy motel room, the walls closing in, the full weight of her catastrophic mistakes crushing down on her. Margaret somehow drove home, somehow made it into her house without screaming, somehow maintained enough composure to wave at Sheila Patterson, who was walking her dog past the driveway. But once inside, she collapsed. She'd been so stupid, so blind, so desperate for validation that she'd handed a manipulative stranger the keys to destroying her life. The money was the least of it. She could access 5,000 without Richard noticing. She had her own accounts from her paralegal days, savings she'd kept separate. But Daniel's threat was real. He had evidence, receipts, texts, probably photos. If Richard found out, the divorce would be brutal. The custody arrangement, not that Emily needed custody at 20, but it would matter symbolically. The division of assets, the humiliation, and the kids. God, Andrew and Emily. The look in Emily's eyes when she'd guessed the truth. The disappointment, the disgust. Margaret pulled out her phone with shaking hands and transferred $5,000 to a separate account she could withdraw from as cash. She texted Daniel the account number. I'll have your money Friday. Then we're done. Delete everything. His reply was immediate. See? That wasn't so hard. Pleasure doing business with you. Friday morning arrived cold and gray, threatening rain. Margaret withdrew the cash from an ATM in Marietta, far from her usual haunts, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap like some amateur criminal. She followed Daniel's texted instructions, to leave it in an envelope under a loose brick behind the Whole Foods in Sandy Springs. She placed the money, drove away, and waited for the nightmare to end. But nightmares don't end with simple transactions. Saturday morning, Richard found her in the kitchen, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips as he held up his iPad. "Margaret," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I received an interesting email this morning from someone claiming to be concerned about our marriage." The room went white. Margaret couldn't breathe. "It contains a rather detailed account of your activities over the past several months, including times, dates, and locations." Richard set the iPad on the counter, screen facing her. She could see the email subject line: "What your wife has been doing." "Richard, I can explain." "Can you?" His calm cracked, rage bleeding through. "Can you explain why my wife of 25 years has been fucking the gardener in cheap motels? Can you explain why there are receipts here for places I've never been? Can you explain why you've been lying to me, to our children, to everyone?" "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, tears streaming. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" Richard's voice rose. "You destroy our marriage. You humiliate me. You throw away everything we've built. And you're sorry?" Emily appeared in the doorway, eyes red. She'd been crying. "Mom, how could you? Baby, please, don't call me that." Emily's voice cracked. "I gave you a chance to tell him yourself. I waited all week and you just kept lying." "You knew?" Richard turned to their daughter. "You knew and didn't tell me." "I told her to tell you or I would," Emily said miserably. "I thought she'd do the right thing." But Margaret hadn't done the right thing. She'd paid her blackmailer and hoped it would disappear. And now Daniel had taken her money and destroyed her anyway. The next hours passed in a blur of accusations and tears. Richard demanded details she couldn't bear to give. Emily couldn't look at her. Margaret tried to explain the loneliness, the neglect, the desperate need to feel valued, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Nothing justified what she'd done. By Sunday, Richard had consulted a divorce lawyer. By Monday, he'd moved into the guest room. By Tuesday, Andrew had called from his apartment, voice tight with anger, asking if it was true. Margaret's life unraveled with shocking speed. Sheila Patterson and the other neighborhood women froze her out. The country club whispered. Emily moved back to her apartment near UJA campus 2 weeks early. Andrew stopped answering her calls, and Daniel Reyes disappeared. His landscaping company phone went to a disconnected number. His apartment in Decatur sat empty, neighbors saying he'd moved out suddenly. Even his mother's house in Smyrna showed no signs of life when Margaret, in desperate grief, drove by. He'd taken her money, destroyed her family, and vanished like smoke. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday in October, delivered to a house that no longer felt like home. Margaret signed them sitting at the kitchen table where she'd once served family dinners, where Daniel had drunk iced tea and looked at her like she mattered. Everything she'd feared had come to pass, and then some. Richard took the house. Margaret moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in Dunwoody, trading her colonial mansion for 800 square feet of beige carpet and white walls. She packed her things while Emily watched silently, helping without speaking, the gulf between them wider than any ocean. "I know you hate me," Margaret said, folding clothes into boxes. "I don't hate you," Emily replied quietly. "I just don't understand you. I don't understand myself." The settlement was brutal but fair. Margaret kept some assets, her car, enough to live on while she figured out her next steps. Richard kept the rest. He was remarrying already, Janet Collins from his firm, whom he'd been seeing for less than a month, but whose existence said everything about how quickly he'd moved on. Maybe he'd been done with their marriage long before the affair. Maybe they'd both been waiting for an excuse to end it. Margaret would never know. Andrew came to see her once, in her new apartment. He sat stiffly on her second-hand couch, arms crossed, face carved from stone. "I'm not here to forgive you," he said. I'm here because you're my mother and Emily says you've barely been eating. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're depressed and alone and everyone in Sandy Springs is talking about you. I know. Do you regret it? The question hung between them. Did she? Margaret thought about those months with Daniel, the lies, the deception, the betrayal, but also the feeling of being seen, wanted, alive. Could she regret something that had woken her up from a slow death, even though it destroyed everything? I regret hurting you and Emily and your father, she said carefully. I regret the lying. I regret being weak enough to fall for a man who was using me. But Andrew, my marriage was dead. I was dying inside it. Something had to break. So you burned it all down? Yes. He stood to leave, paused at the door. Emily's angrier than she shows. She's hurt. Will you forgive her? Give her time. Ask me in a year. He left, and Margaret sat alone in her empty apartment, wondering if a year would be enough time to forgive herself. The lawsuit came in December. Margaret had filed a police report about the blackmail, because what Daniel had done was illegal, regardless of her affair. She'd handed over the texts, the withdrawal receipts, everything. The detective had listened with a bored expression that said, "Lady, you had an affair and got played. That's not really a crime worth our time." But there had been follow-up. Daniel Reyes was apparently a serial con artist who'd worked this scheme before. Lonely, wealthy women, attention and seduction, then threats and money. He had 3 other complaints in Metro Atlanta alone. By January, they'd tracked him to Miami. By February, there were charges. Margaret would have to testify. She'd have to stand in court and describe in detail how she'd been manipulated, used, humiliated. The trial was scheduled for April. Meanwhile, Margaret had to live. She got a job at a law firm in Brookhaven, paralegal work back where she'd started 30 years ago. The younger associates treated her politely but distantly. Everyone knew her story. Sandy Springs wasn't that big, but the work was good. It reminded Margaret that she'd once been capable, intelligent, valuable for more than her marriage, or her home, or her role as Richard Whitmore's wife. On a Tuesday in late February, Margaret walked into her boss's office and asked about the law school information packet she'd seen on his shelf. "Are you serious?" David Chen asked, eyebrows raised. "I'm 54 years old," Margaret said. "I have nothing to lose and maybe something to gain. I was accepted to Emory once, a lifetime ago. Maybe I could be again. You know law school at your age will be hell. My life is already hell. At least this hell would have a purpose." David Chen smiled. "I'll write you a recommendation." The LSAT prep classes started in March. Margaret studied in her tiny apartment while the divorce finalized, while Andrew slowly started talking to her again, while Emily maintained polite distance. The trial happened in April as scheduled. Margaret testified clearly and honestly about everything: the affair, the manipulation, the blackmail. Daniel Reyes sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the charming man who'd seduced her in her garden. The jury saw right through him. He got 3 years for extortion and fraud across multiple victims. Margaret felt nothing watching him sentenced. The man she'd loved had never existed. This was just a stranger who'd seen her vulnerability and exploited it. In May, Emily came to visit. They had dinner at a quiet restaurant in Decatur, and for the first time in months, they really talked. "I'm applying to law school," Margaret told her. Emily's eyes widened. "Seriously? Seriously? Emory, the John Marshall School. Maybe elsewhere. I know it's late. I know it's probably foolish." "It's not foolish," Emily interrupted. Mom, it's actually kind of badass." Margaret laughed, surprising herself. "When was the last time she'd laughed?" "Everything," Margaret said quietly. "I hurt all of you. I made terrible choices. But Emily, I was drowning in that marriage. Not just because of your father, but because of who I'd let myself become. Small, invisible. someone who existed only to serve everyone else. You could have gotten divorced, Emily pointed out, instead of cheating. You're right, I should have, but I was scared and weak and desperate for validation. I let a manipulative man use me because feeling wanted seemed more important than doing what was right. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Do you think you'd do it differently now? God, yes, I'd leave first, I'd be honest. I'd value myself enough to not need some con artist to make me feel worthy. Margaret met her daughter's eyes. I'd be braver. Are you brave now? Margaret thought about her tiny apartment, her paralegal job, her LSAT books, the way people still whispered when she walked by. She thought about Andrew's slow warming, Emily sitting across from her tonight, the law school applications she'd started. I'm learning to be. They didn't fix everything that night, but it was a start. June brought an acceptance email from the John Marshall School of Law in Atlanta. Not Emory. Those dreams were too far gone, but somewhere. Margaret cried when she read it. She'd been accepted to law school at 54 years old, a divorced woman with a scandal in her past and an uncertain future. She called Emily first. Mom, that's amazing! Her daughter's genuine joy made Margaret's chest ache. You don't think I'm crazy? I think you're finally becoming who you were supposed to be. Andrew sent flowers to her apartment when he heard. Richard texted a brief congratulations that was probably genuine under the layers of hurt. In August, Margaret started classes. She was older than her professors. She studied twice as hard as the younger students. She didn't tell anyone her story unless asked, and then she told it honestly. The affair, the manipulation, the crash, the rebuild. Some people judged. Most just nodded with understanding. Everyone had scars. By December, Margaret had made it through her first semester with solid grades. She'd also started seeing a therapist, really examining the patterns that had led to her choices, the need for external validation, the fear of being alone that paradoxically kept her in isolation, the way she'd given away her power bit by bit until she had none left. On Christmas Eve, Emily and Andrew came to her apartment. The tree was small, the presents modest, but they were together. Different than before, but maybe better. More honest. To new beginnings, Emily toasted with sparkling cider. To surviving the fall, Andrew added. To becoming, Margaret said quietly. Whatever that means. They clinked glasses in her small apartment, and Margaret looked at her children, adults now, really, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The scandal would always be part of her story. The whispers would continue in Sandy Springs, though she rarely went back to that life anyway. Richard would remarry Janet and probably be happier than he'd been in years. The perfect colonial house would belong to someone else, but Margaret would have this. Her children slowly coming back to her. Her education reclaimed, her sense of self rebuilt from ash. She'd fallen for a con artist's lies because she'd stopped believing in her own worth. She'd destroyed her marriage because she'd been too afraid to leave it honestly. She'd lost everything because she'd tried to hold on too tight to things that were already dead. But she was still here, still standing, still learning. 2 years later, at 56, Margaret would graduate law school. She'd pass the bar on her second try. She'd start working at a small firm that specialized in helping women navigate difficult divorces. She'd use her story, the ugly, humiliating, honest truth of it, to help others who found themselves trapped in dead marriages or falling for men who sensed their vulnerability. She'd become the person she'd needed when she was drowning. But that was later. Tonight, on Christmas Eve in her modest apartment, Margaret Whitmore was simply a woman who'd fallen, hit bottom, and clawed her way back to standing. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that's enough.